Hi, everyone. I wanted to talk about something that's been on my mind for many years now. And what's interesting to me is, to the best of my knowledge, I haven't heard anybody really discuss this in the Beatles community. Anybody that's affiliated with the Beatles, fans like myself, people who write books, people who do panel discussions, even like a historian such as Mark Lewison who writes books on the Beatles. I've never really heard this point addressed, and if I'm mistaken, let me know. But I'm really curious to bring this up here for a topic of discussion, and that is regarding Pete Best. Pete Best, who was the Beatles drummer before Ringo joined. And what amazes me here is that, well, we know that Pete Best was let go, he was dismissed, and Ringo stepped in and took over and became world famous. But the question here that I'm focusing on is, let me build it up first. People are always saying how the Beatles didn't really like Pete Best. He didn't really fit in with the Beatles, didn't really feel like he was part of the group. And I think that's true. I agree. And he wasn't really a good drummer. There's times when Paul McCartney has now backtracked and said he was a great drummer and all this kind of stuff, which I kind of don't believe that he believed that. I think he's just trying to be nice, which is cool, but I don't think he's going to be that nice in that way. And then you have John Lennon, who was quoted on an audio interview somewhere, I'm going to say around 75, maybe, around there, where he said Pete was a lousy drummer or he never improved. And John went as far to say as, we just hired a guy to get to Hamburg who can keep a stick going for long enough, and we were always going to dump him. This is me paraphrasing. We're always going to dump him when we could find a decent drummer. Now, here's the question. If this is all so, I want to know how come they were ready to go with Pete Best right up to the final moment and they were prepared to get signed. They did get signed, in fact, with Parlophone Records and George Martin. Let me see if I'm making my point clear here. If they were so ready to get rid of Pete and so ready to throw him out at the nearest opportunity, why didn't they do that before they got the recording contract? The fact is, and here's what stumps me, that nobody's really talking about this. They got into the suits when Brian Epstein said, change your attire, be more presentable, more marketable. They put them in the suits. Pete Best went into the suits too. Pete Best was photographed in the suits, and they went down for recording audition and whatnot. And although now I think it's said, this is nitpicking, that it really wasn't an audition when they did Besame Mucho, that they were already signed. But whatever it is, the point I'm saying is they were signed, and the other three Beatles were perfectly content to have Pete as a record-making, wax-producing Beatle as the rest of them. The only problem was that George Martin decided when he heard them that he did not like the drummer, and he said, you could do what you want with Pete Best on the stage, in performances, public appearances, but when we make the records, I want a professional drummer on there. I want another drummer. And then the Beatles turned around and said, okay, bye-bye. You see, that's the part that always confuses me about this, and nobody really discusses it. If they really were so eager to get rid of Pete Best, and I believe they probably were, that still didn't stop them from changing the clothes with him, getting into the suits, and going down to EMI and signing a contract, the four of them. They didn't say, John, Paul, and George didn't say before the contract was signed, wait a minute, before we sign, we want to kick Pete Best out of here and put Ringo in or somebody else in. We want Pete out of here. He doesn't really fit in. If we're going to sign a contract and become recording stars, we want Pete out. They didn't say that. In other words, had George Martin approved of Pete's drumming, had George Martin said, this guy is fine, and he didn't have any qualms about it, they very well may have recorded their first album, Please Please Me, with Pete Best. Maybe their second album. Maybe they would have gone on. Personally, I believe that the Beatles would never have been the phenomenon they became without Ringo. I believe that. I truly believe that if they had had Pete Best in there, they would not have been what we know them to be as far as legendary major recording stars and trendsetters and all that. I really believe that Ringo was also a part of that. But what I'm saying is the Beatles were perfectly willing to go along and do that record do that album, do anything with Pete. It's only because George Martin said no that the Beatles then turned around and said no, even though they probably had been thinking about it anyway. What are your thoughts?